Hey, welcome once again to Strictly Speaking here on True Blue. It is good to have you. Corey DeAngelis, Ph.D., is a senior fellow. This is one of those obligatory bios. It's a good one, though. You need to hear his credentials because what we're going to talk about is really, really important. He's a senior fellow at the American Federation for Children and a visiting fellow at the Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Very well respected. He's been labeled the school choice evangelist and called the most effective school choice advocate since Milton Friedman. He's also executive director at Educational Freedom Institute, a senior fellow at the Reason Foundation, an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, and a board member at the Liberty Justice Center. He holds his PhD in education policy from the University of Arkansas. But of more direct relevance to us today, he's the author of The Parent Revolution. And today, he's going to explain the growth of the school choice movement and hopefully how to improve the state of our government-run schools so parents won't need to shop for a place that will put the needs and the priorities of the students first. Corey DeAngelis today on Strictly Speaking. Hey, Corey, thanks for taking the time with us today. It's so good to talk to you, brother. How are you?
Hey, doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I've been reading a lot of your work, and I've been following you for some time because school choice is really important to me. Full disclosure: former educator here in another lifetime. I'm like early 90s, actually, of 6 years, 90 to 97, and a proud Hillsdale dad of a Hillsdale grad. I know what I want in my education and for our kids' education. So the school choice movement is huge, and so is the parent revolution. So let us start this way. Why did you dedicate your book to the president of the American Federation of Teachers?
Yeah, I dedicated to Randy Weingarten, the teachers unions, for overplaying their hand and inadvertently doing more to advance school choice and homeschooling than anyone could have ever imagined. If you want to look at the back of the book, you could actually take Ted Cruz's advice, senator from my home state of Texas. He says you can, quote, ruin Randy Weingarten's day by reading this book. And the reason that I thank them for overplaying their hand and awakening a sleeping giant, which happens to be parents, is that they fought to keep the schools closed for so long with as much fear mongering as possible. They showed families what was happening through Zoom school, through remote learning, which we really should have just called it remotely learning. There wasn't a lot of learning going on. Families got to see that the schools were focusing more on indoctrination than on education. They weren't focusing on the basics. They were focusing more on the LGBTs and the ABCs, and parents were pissed. So they started to fight back at school board meetings because they heard for a long time that if you want to have a say in your kid's education, you could just go show up at the school board and of course they'll listen to you. It didn't actually play out that way. The school boards cut off their mics. They labeled parents as domestic terrorists. The NSBA, the School Boards Association, sent a letter to Biden saying that under the Patriot Act of all things, parents should be investigated for quote unquote domestic terrorism. And earlier drafts of that letter actually called for the military to be deployed to school board meetings and the National Guard to be deployed to school board meetings to try to bully and silence parents into submission. It was federal government overreach, the heavy hand of the state when they were trying to just tell parents, they were sending a message. If you want to stand up for your kids, we're going to come after you because we believe, the school boards, that we're in charge, that the government is the sole decision maker for your children, and that you should just sit down and shut up. Well, guess what? Parents were upset about that. You don't come after mama bears and papa bears and try to take their cubs away from them. So parents were only emboldened to push back even harder. And so thus, the parent revolution had ignited during the COVID era when the unions were crying about going back to work. They were threatening safety strikes. They were holding children's education hostage for billions of dollars in ransom payments from taxpayers. They were tweeting, the Chicago Union, saying that, quote, the push to reopen schools is rooted in sexism, racism, and misogyny. They threw every buzzword at the wall to see what would stick. But now, thankfully, because they were so stupid, they've been so drunk on power for so long, the unions, they're finally losing their stranglehold on other people's children's education because now we have 12 states already in the past 3 years alone that have passed universal school choice, full throated, no picking winners and losers. Everybody can now take their kids' education funding to the school that works best for them. And that provides incentives for the public schools, even to do a better job, not to label you as a terrorist, but to try to work with you as a partner, as a customer, and to try to do the right thing.
That's a great point that you make, because the goal isn't to shut down all the government schools. It's to make them better,
Right.
make them have to compete to keep kids rather than keep them there by geographical location.
Sure.
Um, I don't know if there was ever any military or National Guard in these parking lots, but I do recall that during that period, it might have been in Loudoun County, Virginia, but I do recall that there were FBI agents who were showing up at meetings and were running license plates to see what they could dig up on people who were inside daring to question the authority of the state. Ultimately, the school
Sure.
board, as an agent of the state. So they were literally going to investigate parents and see how they can make their lives miserable if there was something in their background, if there was a parking ticket or anything else for that matter. But they were literally doing that, right? FBI agents.
Yeah, they actually had the FBI create a threat tag specifically for parents protesting at school board meetings, for having the audacity to go show up and do what they've always told us to do, that if you aren't happy with what you're getting, that there's this democratic form of accountability in the public school system. That just goes to show you this whole model was a make-believe fairy tale. It doesn't actually work out in practice because they only wanted to hear from you if you actually agreed with them. If you didn't, they wanted you to sit down and shut up. They wanted to bully you. They wanted to silence you. But thankfully, when you have school choice, that changes that power dynamic completely. And it almost counterintuitively, when you have more choice, you should be less likely to have to exercise it, because then when you go to the school board, when you talk to your students' teachers, well, guess what? They'll have an incentive to say, well, maybe we'll change our game, we'll do a better job. And this has been the case in Florida, for example. They've had school choice for decades. They've incrementally expanded it over time. Last year they went all in with all families being eligible. But in Florida, a couple decades ago, they were at the bottom of the pack in the nation's report card, the NAEP
Mhm.
scores. Now, fast forward to the latest iteration, they're at the top of the pack. The US News and World Report shows that they're the number one system for education in the state of Florida. And that despite them spending far less than the national average. They're knocking it out of the park. And 10 out of the 11 rigorous studies on the topic in Florida find that the public schools do up their game. It's a rising tide that lifts all boats.
And that is even with the obstacle in front of them of being one of the most multicultural states in the
That's
country.
right. That's right.
Because of a huge population of Hispanic speakers down there, that's so much harder for teachers. You're going to have to either be bilingual or have a way to teach, different languages. When you can achieve at that level, despite that obstacle, that's huge.
And that might be part of the reason why DeSantis actually won Miami of all places in his latest
Dade
reelection
County.
in 2020. He won by I think 7 points in Miami. He won overall by 20 points, and he
Yeah.
won with that Latino vote by about 7 or 8 points. And if you looked at the scholarship program in Florida at the time, it's disproportionately serving lower income and non-white families, actually. And in 2018, not a lot of people remember this, but DeSantis barely won his first governor's race. He won by
Yeah.
a fraction of a
One
point.
or 2 points or so. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was going against Andrew Gillum, a Democrat. He was a black guy who actually called to get rid of the scholarship program for low income kids and disproportionately non-white kids. So it was over 100,000 kids using the program at the time. And the headline in the Wall Street Journal the next day was that school choice moms tipped the governor's race in Florida. And what they were talking about was CNN exit polling actually showed that black moms in particular came out in force for DeSantis much higher than expected. So parents who might have disagreed with him on a lot of other issues, they made school choice a priority. They wanted their kid to get that scholarship, to get a better education, to have a better future than the opportunities that they had when they were younger. And so that became a single issue vote for a lot of people. And it just goes to show you school choice is the right thing to do. But even more recently, it's become a political winner too. And since then, Florida was a purplish state. Now it's gone to super majorities of Republicans in both chambers. If the Democrats are smart, they'll see what's going on here and they'll get on board too. The problem is the Democratic Party is a wholly owned subsidiary of the teachers' unions. Randy Weingarten, who I dedicated the book to, her union's the American Federation of Teachers. 99.97% of their campaign contributions in 2022 went to Democrats. It's a money laundering operation. It ought to be illegal. But now we have a new union in town, one for the kids, the parents, and they're winning. And it's glorious to see.
I'm glad you went back to Weingarten because I was going to do that. Dylan, pull up that article if you would there, and let's show everybody this. And I want to ask
Oh,
Corey
of
about this. You
course.
saw this from last year. Among many really out there things that she has said, this one to me is particularly egregious. Randy Weingarten likens parental rights advocates to segregationists, sparking outrage. But don't just take the headline for it. Let's watch and listen to this, Corey. Go ahead, Dylan.
Those same words that you heard in terms of wanting segregation post Brown v. Board of Education, those same words you hear today. It's not, I was kind of gobsmacked when I was talking to Southern Poverty Law Center, and they showed me the same words: choice, parental rights.
Oh, you
Okay.
can't have that.
So, Corey, what is she talking about here? How is she comparing school choice and parental rights to segregation following Brown versus the board?
It's the radical left notion of whenever they're losing an argument, they get to the bottom of the barrel of scraping for arguments and they label everything they don't like as racist. When in fact, there were staunch segregationists in the 1950s in Virginia who actually locked arm with the teachers' unions of all groups to fight against school vouchers because they knew the public schools were already so segregated, allowing families to have a choice that didn't have choices before led to more racial integration. So the segregationists were on the team of the teachers unions in some cases. The Wall Street Journal had a great article on this called School Choice's Anti-Racist History by Phil Magnus. And it goes over some of this history. But if you look at the evidence today, because the government schools are so segregated, there are 8 studies on this topic, 7 of them positive, finding that more school choice actually leads to more integration, not the other way around. School choice is an equalizer. The most advantaged already have some form of school choice. They can live in the neighborhoods that tend to be assigned to the best quote unquote public schools. We shouldn't even call them public schools. Families have gone to jail for lying about their address to get into better so-called public schools. They discriminate on the basis of zip code. They're highly segregated. And if the left were honest about their definition of systemic racism, they would bring that same energy to the government school system that has disproportionate outcomes by income, by race, by zip code. And they would fight for school choice as a solution to that problem.
Okay, 2 follow-ups to that. First of all, when it comes to that integration versus segregation thing, and I don't want to make this overtly political. It just things fall this way. I want to talk about kids and schools and parents and rights. But there happens to be a certain one of the 46 presidents we have had who actually, when integration of the schools was brought forth, I believe he stood on the floor of the United States Senate and declared that he didn't like the idea of his kids growing up in a
Ah,
racial jungle.
jungle.
Literally
Yep.
used the word racial jungle, a trope, of course, which has been insulting and a slur toward African Americans. Didn't like the idea of young black kids, jungleizing his white kids' school grounds. Blown away by it, but it happened. And I think you probably know which of the 46 presidents that was.
Yeah, it's Joe Biden. He's a total hypocrite on school choice. He went to private school. He sent his own kids to private school, and then he fights against school choice for others. I don't blame him for seeking out better options, but what he is doing is pulling up the ladder from behind himself, fighting against educational opportunities for others. And guess what? Donald Trump, former president, who's running again against Joe Biden, he does support school choice for other families as well. So he actually endorsed the book. By the way, he said Corey DeAngelis is a fighter for parental rights, and didn't make it onto the back of the book because he recently endorsed the book a couple weeks ago, and now it's on the national bestseller list. But it shouldn't be a political issue at all. If you ask voters if they support school choice, Democrats, independents, all different racial backgrounds, have majority support of the concept of the money following the child. I think most people understand the money's meant for educating the kid, not for propping up and protecting a building. It should follow the student to the institution that best meets their needs and aligns with their values. If that's the public school, fine. If you like your public school, you can keep your public school, but for real this time, and they do get better. But if not, you should be able to take that funding to a private, charter, or home-based education option. It's the only way out of the mess that is the one-size-fits-all system. You might like your public school and it might be a good option for you, but it might have values that are inherently counter to a particular family. And it might be unsafe. There might be a bullying environment going on. It might be that it's not a specialized mission that the child happens to be interested in. And so one size fits all is even another dimension of the problem. It is true that you have some public schools in places like Baltimore, 40% of their high schools have, guess what, 0% proficiency in math. Not a single kid in almost half of their high schools are proficient in math. And yet they spend tons of money in the US. On average, we spend about $20,000 per kid per year in the government run schools, whereas private school tuition on average nationwide is only about 12 or 13,000. So school choice can save taxpayer money, respect parental rights, and allow everyone to not be forced into a system that they inherently disagree with. Look, Vodi Bakum said it best. We cannot continue to send our children to Caesar for their education and be surprised when they come home as Romans. The good news is parents aren't surprised anymore. And now they're pushing back from all different types of parties, and they want choice. They don't want to be stuck in a system that's not working for their kid for whatever reason.
All right. I want to talk about something that's hard to talk about, and I don't think people truly think about this enough. And I talk about this on a regular basis, again, with my background being in education. I want to know if, when you talked about those people being trapped by their zip codes, and people will lie to be able to say, I live in this nicer area so that my kid can go to one of the nicer schools. It's chicken and egg here. Do the nicer neighborhoods, which are populated by successful families, lead to the better schools, or are the better schools making those kids better? And the reason I ask that is because I don't think it's accidental that the kids who grow up in mom and dad households, who have somebody checking their homework every day, somebody making sure they're in class every day, somebody that goes to the
Yeah.
parent teacher conferences, that they're successful. And I don't think it's because those teachers are necessarily better than the ones over here in an impoverished neighborhood, but there's a single parent, nobody checking, not even sure if they're in school, if they're ditching, or if they're out in the streets, or what have you. Nobody's making sure homework is done. You see what I'm saying? So, what
Mhm.
makes a successful educational situation? Is it
Yeah.
more the home, or is it the quality of instruction in those schools?
So it's both of those things, right? So when you have more choice, you get more parental involvement too, just by definition, right? So if families who were depressed about their other educational alternatives because they couldn't afford them, if you give them the funding, you allow them to choose, they all of a sudden have a strong incentive to get involved in their child's educational decision making. So those things are kind of related, and at the same time, look, one of my first studies actually looked at the Milwaukee voucher program and started in 1990. And we had long term data, student level data, and we were able to connect access to the school choice program to reductions in crime later on in life. And this was after controlling for things like whether the student was in a single parent household. And it also happened to be the case, to get to your point, that if you were in a single parent household, that increased your likelihood of growing up to commit crime. So there's all of these things are moving at the same time in different directions based on the factor that you're looking at. But parental involvement's it's huge. School choice is not a silver bullet, but if you are stuck in a school that is just wasting the money, maybe they're fraudulently spending the money, or they're just hiring more administrators, that's obviously not a parent problem. That's a problem with the school making bad decisions. So it's all of the above. And if we have more choice, we should row in the right direction. It's not a silver bullet, not a perfect solution, but it's absolutely necessary but not sufficient.
I like to do origin stories. I like to know how things started and why they got there. Where because when I was growing up, and I'm kind of at the beginning end of the Gen X generation, but none of my memories from school. I don't know what party my teacher belonged to. I don't know whether my teacher was gay or straight. I don't know if they were married or not married. I didn't know if they had a life outside of the classroom. I didn't know if they slept in a bed down in the boiler room. As far as I know, they're just connected to school. They teach me and test me and sometimes yell at me. It's so much different now. When did it change? What drove that? What was the genesis of we went from educating, reading, writing, science, and so forth to political and cultural indoctrination? When did that start?
Yeah, it's hard to tell when they've started to flaunt it, more flagrantly. But I do believe it has gotten worse over time. But I do think it has been the radical left has infiltrated the government school system for decades. I think it's been like that for a long while, and not every public school is the
Two,
same. So, like,
2 decades, 3 decades? Like, what are we talking?
several
'Cause I'm not,
decades. I mean, the Department of Education at the federal level was created in 1979, so several decades that we've had federal government overreach into the schools. And look, that department should have never been born. The word education is not in the U.S. Constitution. It was a payoff by Jimmy Carter to the National Education Association, the largest teachers union in the country. But all that aside, it's hard to tell because different schools are doing things better than others. There are schools today that might be okay at focusing on the basics, but for a lot of parents, they're complaining and they're posting videos on social media and things that they're finding through FOIA requests on social media. I think social media and COVID both kind of just revealed more of what was already happening, but also I believe like in 2020 with the George Floyd stuff and the Black Lives Matter, they started injecting that into the classroom too with the 1619 project. So it's definitely been amplified, but I think the problems have been there for a long time, even if it wasn't as outward about it as it is now. I think the left has figured out the radical left has figured out that they basically don't even have to have their own kids. They could infiltrate the government school system and raise other people's children in their socialist worldview. And I think that's the problem. And so even if you don't have kids of your own, or if you're not even a grandparent, let's say you homeschool your own kids and you think things are fine. Well, there's still 50 or so million kids going through the government school system each year where they're churning out Democrat voters year after year with using indoctrination for 13 years of children's lives for 7 hours a day. That's a huge problem. You have to strike at the root. You can't win this game, this war, just by outpopulating the other side. You can't just have more kids. And so it's important, most important for parents to take control of their own kids' education, but you want other families to have choice too, so that they can sort into an institution that doesn't teach them um, a lot of things that just don't that can't be defined as education, that are just that fit under the indoctrination umbrella, whether it has to do with radical left Marxist ideology, or whether it's just the teacher implying in one way or the other that they don't like Donald Trump, or that Republicans are evil people. That's going to have profound effects. These are young, impressionable minds that we're dealing with, and they know it. And that's why when Republicans try to ban certain concepts that divide kids based on immutable characteristics, well, the left freaks out about it and they quadruple down. And the unions have done this recently. They've been so drunk on power for so long, they felt like they've been untouchable, right? They've always had this kind of monopoly on money, but more importantly, they've had a monopoly on the minds of other people's children. I think that's the more nefarious aspect of all of this. And that's what's really ignited this parent revolution. Parents have said, "Yeah, I know you wanted to keep the money, but now there's something else going on here. School quality is multidimensional. It's not just test scores." Parents who thought that their kids were okay based on test scores got to see through Zoom school that they're not just focusing on math, reading, and writing.
Right. Corey, I want to come back to, by the way, the money to follow the kids and what that does, by the way, to the kids that are left in the public schools whose parents don't know or understand or believe that there are other options out there, because there's a big issue there. But I want to talk about that balance. You talk about a parent revolution. You got Randy Weingarten over here saying you're a segregationist and all kinds of other things if you want to have a say in your kid's education. We got you writing a book about the parents' revolution. Parent has to have a right to, not dictate, but certainly participate in their kids' education. I want to talk about that balance because when I first started teaching, and I will never forget this because it was my first fall parent-teacher conference session in the fall of 1991. And I'm a new teacher, 23 years old, and I'm talking to a parents of a kid, and I'm saying, listen, he is a pain in the what. He is screwing around. He's not paying attention. Which, you know what, if he wants to flunk, I'll work with him. But if he keeps to himself and is clowning, it's one thing. But when he's disrupting the other kids, we have to do something here. So I need you to impress upon him that this is not going to be tolerated. And the parent said to me, well, he does that same stuff at home. We was kind of hoping you could straighten him out. And that stuck with me because I'm thinking, these parents trust me to educate their kid. They're also trusting me to a degree to raise their kid for 7 hours a day and to discipline them and so on and so forth. So you understand my point. There are some parents who want a say in what is going on in there, and others are like, hey man, leave me out of it. Just teach them and control them, and it's on you now. That's a tough balance.
Yeah, look. I mean, I think because we have this system set up where people just understand, I don't have a choice in the matter. It's just I'm going to ship my kids off to the government for 13 years, 7 hours a day. The government has basically wedged itself between parents and children. I believe some parents, as a result, abdicated a lot of that responsibility to the government-run school system. And so, again, like I mentioned this earlier, that it wouldn't be a perfect solution, but at least giving families a choice to say, hey, you got to pick where your kid's going to go to school. Here's the money for them. It's not cash. You have to direct where it's going to go in the form of a voucher or a scholarship. But just having them, that would change the game dramatically, at least on the margins. Not for all parents, but it would incentivize people, would push them in that direction towards, hey, this is part of my responsibility. I'm the one seeking out the quality of the schools. I will become more involved in the day to day at the dinner table too. So I think, again, this is not a perfect solution, and I'll never say that it is. But um, the teachers also need to be empowered with discipline policies too. And like you mentioned a second ago, that we've had some restorative justice policies where I think part of it was a result of Obama's Dear Colleague letter having a chilling effect on teachers who were afraid that if they punish students, that they would get in trouble.
Mhm.
And so that's a huge problem. And I think we need to allow for
Particularly
more
students.
flexibility.
Yeah, particularly certain students. And that made
Yeah,
it very
I mean,
difficult on
the
teachers.
dear colleague letter was all about if you have disproportionate disciplinary outcomes by race or by even just special needs status, then people thought they were going to get in trouble for that
Yeah.
because either their school was racist or that they were just anti children with disabilities. But some kids get labeled as having a special need by having behavioral issues.
Right.
So it's like, so you're not allowed to discipline people who are labeled this way because they have discipline problems. Do you see how that can become it's just like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? I mean,
It is.
it's just it, and so I think choice would actually benefit teachers too, because in the private sector, you typically have more autonomy. And especially with these micro schools that have started popping up during the pandemic, they were calling them pandemic pods. Teachers were starting miniature schools in their households with 5 to 10 children getting together. They do this really well in Arizona, for example, and they've actually had families using their scholarships to pay for these micro schools. But during the pandemic era, because so many families were doing this, guess what the New York Times did? And some school districts were implying that this is racism because a lot of like the schools are closed. It was more affluent families that were able to access the micro schools, and instead of just saying, well, this is why the school should be open, they were trying to like label the parents choosing micro schools as bad people. And then they wouldn't take the logical next step of, well, if we had the money follow the child, guess what? more families who couldn't afford the micro schools before would now be able to access them as well, while the government failure factories were closed. And in the Washington Post during the pandemic era, they actually highlighted a story of a New Jersey public school teacher. She had been in the system for decades, and she started a pandemic pod or micro school herself. And she was earning about the same amount of money, and she had a lot more autonomy. She didn't have to deal with all the bureaucratic red tape in the government school system. And she had, guess what, a fraction of the class size. She had 30 or 40 in the public school. Now she had 5 to 10 children at a time. And if you had more of that money following the child, the teacher could have probably earned even more than what she was earning in the public school system, because you cut out the middleman. Instead of having all that money go to administrators and buildings, it can more directly go from families to the teacher. And so there's also been 5 studies. I wrote about this in a blog at the Washington Examiner called School Choice Benefits Teachers Too. And all 5 of these studies, it's not a lot of them, but it is what it is, more school choice in the form of charter or private school competition doesn't just lead to better outcomes in the public schools, but higher teacher salaries in the public schools. Because instead of spending the money on administrative bloat and wasting it, if you're not a monopoly anymore, you have to think about where you allocate resources. And so they put it towards the classroom where it's supposed to go, and teachers benefit too. So this isn't student and parent versus teacher. It's not even public versus private. It's just about families having a choice, and that will benefit employees too, because it means that their employer is no longer a monopoly that has no incentive to do the right thing.
So when you talk about pandemic pods and what are we calling those? What was the other
Micro schools.
micro schools? Yeah, it resembles homeschooling
Yeah.
and homeschooling. Groups that were created, these little co-ops where one parent who could homeschool will invite other kids from the neighborhood, because not everybody can homeschool, and I want to talk about that aspect of it as well for a couple of reasons. Number one, if you have working parents, and most families, particularly in middle class, both parents work, they
Yeah.
don't have time. If they do have time, and they may not have the ability, particularly when you get into some of the more impoverished. Now, this is not a slur or a slam, but the reality is many or most of the people living in lower middle class or impoverished class, they don't have high educations. That's part of the combination there. And because of that, they're not really capable of getting the books and teaching their own kids and giving them homeschool lessons. So we've got a real problem here in terms of, I hate to say the word equity, but opportunity for some parents. They don't have to work, both parents don't have to work, and they're a little more educated, and they can handle homeschooling their kids. Others who don't have those opportunities. So is
Yeah. I mean,
homeschooling a real strong option or no?
I would say it can't get much worse in some cases. Baltimore having 40% of the kids, schools having 0% proficiency rate. So even if a parent that is low income doesn't have a doctorate in something, I think they could still figure things out with, we have Khan Academy now. We have online learning. So if you're not the expert yourself on a particular subject, you might be able to find out these resources either online, and they have like virtual charter schools too that provide the curriculum and provide the online learning, and also have sometimes teachers from an in-person setting teaching kids who are at home through the online learning. So there's other ways to kind of do it, but also I think, to get more directly to your point, that you can also be involved in these homeschool co-ops
Yeah,
where you're not the actual, like, if you got to go to work and do other things, understandable, but then you can still have the benefits of kind of a more of a one-to-one, not exactly one-to-one, because it's not just homeschooling in a pure sense. It's a
right.
co-op kind of environment or a micro school. And this has become so popular in places like Arizona, where they do have scholarships paying for the micro schools right now, that the NEA, the largest teachers union, found this to be such a threat to their monopoly that they put out an opposition research sheet on a micro school founder named Kelly Smith. He started Prenda Micro Schools in Arizona, and they've been just blossoming. Families love it. And the NEA saw this. They knew that this was going to be a big problem for them, because the micro schools are really shaping up the education sphere right now. You don't have to build another brick and mortar private school. You can do this even in rural areas where there might not be as much demand for a huge brick and mortar factory model looking school. And you don't have to be the home educator yourself. They hire a guide or a tutor to facilitate the learning process. And you also get the benefits of that one-to-one or more so one-to-one small class size environment. You have a safer environment, but you also get some of that socialization too. A lot of people might say, "Oh, homeschooling might be problematic if you don't socialize enough." I think that's I think that's not a legitimate argument against homeschooling myself, because you can cut out a lot of the negative forms of socialization too by homeschooling. Like, I went to government schools in San Antonio, Texas growing up, and I was around. There was a lot of drugs, gang activity, fights. It was cool to get into fights. They used to play this game called 10 Seconds on my middle school campus, where people would fight for 10 seconds and then they'd call it, a third party would call it. And that was kind of the cool thing to do. People would get rolled into gangs in the bathrooms. It was just, that's not socialization that I think anybody really cares to miss out on. And you can socialize with these homeschool co-op groups, the micro school pandemic pods, and you can socialize through sports or other activities as well. And I think that's just another benefit of the micro school environment, where it's not just you, it's also other peers around you as well.
I'm glad you brought up sports and other activities too, Corey, because I want to go back to funding now, and I want to take the other side for a second. I got a kid that I cannot afford to put into public school, or excuse me, a private school or parochial school or whatever. I'm stuck here. But not only am I stuck here, my kid likes it here. And my kid plays basketball and my kid plays football. And those stadiums are in major need of renovation or upkeep or whatever. And when you take the dollars away from this district to say it can follow the kid over here to that charter school or that parochial school or whatever, there's not enough to even have those
Mhm.
facilities here for the main school. And as you know, those are massive parts of education
Yeah.
for a lot of people. It's about more than just,
Yeah.
test tubes and slide rules. We
Yeah.
need those things too. So what do we do? What do we do when we take that money away from
Yeah.
the districts that use them for those things?
Yeah, so one, I'll say this fear mongering hasn't come to fruition anywhere. And we've had school choice for the past several decades in different states, to varying degrees. 30 states having some form of private school choice already. And in Texas, my home state, this fear mongering was repeated when charter schools were first being introduced. We have plenty of charter schools now. And guess what? The stadiums have gotten bigger. The Friday Night Lights has gotten better. It hasn't gone away. And so, I mean, if the burden of proof should be on the people making these absurd claims, it doesn't actually happen. The public schools do get better. The extracurriculars are still there. And guess what? A lot of people do see that as a benefit. They like their football, they like the extracurriculars. And so, guess what? They continue to send their children there. And the 20 or so thousand dollars meant for educating their child continues to go to that school. And if someone leaves for a school choice initiative, um, it's typically only half of the funding that follows the student. These aren't like large numbers of families with a mass exodus leaving the system. It's typically a few percentage points in the first few years of families voting with their feet. And they typically only take half. So let's say we spend 20,000 in the public schools per year on average. It's only the state portion that follows the student. That happens to be around $10,000 per student on average. So what does that mean mathematically? The public schools get to keep the local funding, the federal funding, and so on a per student basis, they actually end up more well off, they better off. They end up with higher per student funding in the public schools. That's just how it works. You lose the
The
full student.
communities don't though. The communities and the homeowners that pay the price though, because that's the local funding is their property taxes are going to have to be
Yeah.
jacked up to make up for the state funding that is gone. If there is a more of a mass exodus, if we get unchecked school choice, which you advocate, and I actually do too, but I'm playing devil's advocate here. If we get full mass exodus and there's a large number that leave, they cannot survive unless they jack up those property taxes.
Well, I want to say that because
Really?
if you're losing, I mean, just imagine if you stopped shopping at Walmart and you wanted to shop at HEB or Trader Joe's or wherever else, and Walmart got to keep half of your funding each week for groceries. That would make no sense, but it would be a good deal for Walmart. I would argue it's a good deal for the public schools. They get to keep any money at all, thousands of dollars per kid that they're no longer even educating. They can cut costs in other areas. They can cut some of the administrators, right? They can cut. Look, if there's a school that has no more students, if we're talking, big mass exodus, why keep the school running if no one's there? You should allocate those resources to other schools that are doing a good job, And so at the end of the day, we should focus on the needs of the students as opposed to the jobs program for administrators. It should be an education initiative for kids.
What are your thoughts on the classical education charter schools? I mentioned Hillsdale before. There's another Hillsdale Barney charter school that's opening up here in Northeast Ohio, where we're filming from today. And I think there's a few dozen of them all around the Midwest. I love them. I
Yeah.
know I'm very intimate with the knowledge of the curriculum there and some of the leaders, administrators. Tuition free classical education. And I think it's a better alternative, really, than even to the homeschools.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. And look, it's families are seeking these out for a reason. It's they're not getting it in the government schools, and these are schools that are more likely to align with their values. And schooling, whether we like it or not, is almost an extension of parenting. I mean, you're sending your kid to an institution. You want them to be around people that you trust and have a set of values that are aligned with your own. You don't want the schools to be working against everything that you're doing at home. And yes, they're tuition free. So it's a charter school, it's privately run, but it's funded by taxpayer dollars. The funding follows the student to charter schools. But I will say one of the problems that should be remedied in more states is that the charter schools only get a fraction of the funding of what they spend in the traditional government run schools.
Hmm.
Like I've done studies on this at the University of Arkansas where I did my PhD, and we've looked at several cities, and on average we found that the charter schools receive about 20 to 30% less per student than what they spend in the government run schools. So it's you talk about equity, the students, if their assigned school's not working, they're losing a lot of money when they switch to an alternative. And guess what? Those schools typically do better at a fraction of the cost. And so, um, another issue is that the government sometimes gets to tell the charter schools whether they can even open or not. And it's worse than that. It's a lot of the times, like in places like Virginia, of all places, they only have 7 charter schools in Virginia last time I checked. That's because the district gets to approve their competition, the charter schools that get to open or not. It's like McDonald's getting veto power over a Burger King opening in the area. That would make no sense, and they'd always say, "Oh yeah, they can't open for whatever reason." And that's what the districts do. Whenever these Hillsdale schools get introduced, and they're always good ideas, the districts will say, "Oh," they'll throw up all these reasons, and we all know the main reason is they don't want to lose any funding at all. And it's typically these districts that are doing a really bad job academically, and some of them will just upfront say, "Well, we don't want to lose any money because kids might go there." But
Yeah.
that's an argument for choice, not against it. If you're not confident in your product and you're failing, that's a reason why families should be able to choose, not why they should be trapped in schools that aren't working for them. And the schools that are doing a good job, they're confident. They welcome the competition. And so it's a red flag whenever you hear the main argument against choice is that this is going to cause a mass exodus, it's going to destroy or decimate our institutions. It actually doesn't, that doesn't happen, but they don't want to have to compete. I talk about how they have to up their game. They don't want to have to change anything. They want to continue the gravy train. They don't want to have to do a better job. And in my home state of Texas, we got a handful of administrators who make more than the president of the United States, over $400,000 a year. And for what? For what? They're not doing a good job.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly the point. And I want to go back to those public schools now, government run schools. And let's talk about the people who are staying there. And let's talk about the parent revolution. Parents are like, appreciate all the opportunities to put my kids elsewhere. We're pro school choice, but we want our kids to be here. We like the locale, obviously. We like the whole vibe about the extracurriculars and so forth. But we want to say, in what they learn. We want to say about whether or not the pornographic literature and illustrative books that are on the bookshelves, we want to have a say there. First of all, how much of a say are we talking about here? And number two, what about when there is a divide among parents? What if
Yeah.
there is a significant number of the
Yeah.
parents that say, I don't like this, but I'm okay with that. And the other one say, well, I don't like that, and I'm okay with this. Now are we going to have parent votes at every meeting about what's allowed to happen? Or does it have to come from the faculty?
That's the nature of the one size fits all system, and it's why things are going to continue in the trend towards school choice because this is inevitable. That families, by their very nature, are going to disagree about how they want to raise their kids, and that's okay. It's okay to disagree about these things. What's not okay is that we use zip code, and it's typically a special interest that controls how to raise other people's children. It's typically not even the majority view in the area. And so at least we should move towards a system that allows not a special interest to control what is taught, but to allow them, at least the majority of families, to have more of a say. And when it comes to parents, they mostly just want the schools to focus on the basics. So if we could start there at the bare minimum of not having the divisive concepts in the classroom, whether that's too far left or too far right, if you can just stay in the middle and focus on math, reading, and writing, I think that would be a huge step in the right direction. And in the Parent Revolution, in fact, in one of the last chapters, this might seem like it's just a school choice uh, book. I think that is the best solution we have, but it isn't sufficient. There are other tweaks to the system that are provided in one of the last chapters about just having more transparency. Where's the money going? We should pass bills to have information available to parents. Where's the money going? What is the curriculum? How about you have the school board elections aligned with the general election? Because not a lot of people know this. The school board elections and bond elections are at random times when they have very low turnout. And the special interests know this. And the nature of special interest politics is that if there is a low turnout election, they're going to be the ones that are disproportionately likely to show up, which means they'll have an outsized influence on the outcome of the election. So you'll have in conservative areas radical progressives on the school board, one, because they're nonpartisan elections and they hide behind this nonpartisan kind of idea when they actually are partisans. They don't have a Republican versus Democrat on the ballot. And so that a lot of times people will just vote for the person with the education doctorate, which might be someone who went through a Marxist education department. And
Happens all the time.
and if you could just increase voter turnout, what's funny is a lot of the radical left will say that Republicans are threats to democracy, they're engaging in voter suppression. But then when it comes to education and issues, they're the ones that don't want people to turn out to vote because they want the teachers union handpicked candidates to win. And so, like, simple policies like this, let's align it with the general election, let's increase voter turnout. They'll fight against it, but if they don't, it'll help increase the chances of parents having more of a say. At the same time, if they do fight against it and they successfully block such a policy proposal, it'll make them look like the radicals they are. In California, for example, there was a school district that passed a very simple policy, more of a Republican district. They passed a simple policy, which was don't keep secrets from parents. If a child changes their gender at school, you better tell the parents. Well, it passed. But guess what? The heavy hand of the state, the attorney general, fought to keep secrets from parents. He filed a lawsuit against the district. My organization, the Liberty Justice Center, I'm on their board, defended Chino Unified School District. So look, even if these policies get blocked by authoritarians who think that kids belong to the government and not their children, well, it's going to make them look bad. And when people look bad, politicians sometimes will lose votes. And when they lose votes, maybe then they'll have an incentive to change, to read the tea leaves. If the political winds shift towards our side even more, I think some blue states might even be able to come along on the issue if they have to. They're not going to do it just out of nowhere. They're not just going to snap their finger and say, all of a sudden, we're not going to listen to the teachers' unions anymore. It's going to require one party being the first mover. And this is one of the main points I bring up in the book in chapter 4 of the Parent Revolution, is something I call bipartisanship through hyperpartisanship, which might sound counterintuitive, but the more that the GOP leans into parental rights as a political winner, like we saw with Glenn Youngkin in Virginia beating Terry McAuliffe, the more it becomes a form of political suicide for Democrats to oppose it, and they'll start to defect on the issue. We already saw some of this happening. 2 Democrats, one in North Carolina and in Georgia, they flipped parties. They switched to the GOP on the issue of school choice, sitting legislators. You think about Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro. In 2022, he was up by double digits in the polls. He was the attorney general at the time, running for governor. And his opponent, Doug Mastriano, the Republican, started calling him a hypocrite on school choice. He said, hey, Josh, you went to private school. You're a hypocrite. You don't support school choice for others. Right after that, coincidentally, Josh Shapiro included private school choice in his education platform,
Hmm.
even named a bill that was run by a Republican that year, and went on Fox News in 2023 reiterating his support for school choice. Now, he might have just been reading the tea leaves. He was just, putting his thumb in the air, seeing where the political winds were shifting. Um, and look, I would rather it be a true change of heart, but it reminds me of something that Milton Friedman once famously said, which is the way that you change things is not by getting the right people into office. It helps, obviously, if they vote for the right things, but the way that you truly change things over time is by creating a climate of opinion where it becomes politically profitable for the wrong people to do the right thing. And so I think we're getting there. We've had some Democrats voting consequential votes this year in Nebraska, Missouri, and Georgia, voting for school choice and helping get it done. In Louisiana, 20% of their House Democrats voted for universal school choice. And so I think we're moving in that direction towards bipartisanship now. But it's not going to be because we just make Democrats feel good about the issue, the politicians, and just make left-leaning arguments for school choice. There are good left and right-leaning arguments for school choice, don't get me wrong. But the way that they're going to come along is by them feeling political pressure to do so. And that
Right.
is a result of parents locking arms, Republican, Democrat, and Independent, to fight for their right to educate their kids as they see fit.
We only have a few minutes left here, but I want to use these last few minutes to talk about another element of the parent revolution because you're obviously focused on school choice and schools. But I want to know if there needs to be a parent revolution against the medical industry as well as the education industry. You mentioned, the changing genders. There are what are they called, gender closets and things like that now, where parents drop their kids off as little boys. They get to go into the closet, change, and spend their day as a little girl, and then come back home the other way again. All that nonsense. And all of this is because of the medical industry now and this movement to affirm every little whim that a confused young kid has. We're affirming this. It's the only way you're going to save your kid's life because your kid is going to kill himself if you don't do this. And so, how do parents push back against
I mean,
medicine?
if
Trust the
if
doctor.
if anything, you're saving the kid's life by having the parent more involved, not by wedging yourself between the parent and confusing that child and giving them long-term damage by confusing them so much at a young, impressionable age. So this is a form of widespread state-sanctioned child abuse, and it ought to be outlawed. It is in some states. And look, yeah, the medical industry is profiting off of confusing young children
Oh,
and committing these surgeries that are a form of child abuse. And a lot of this is irreversible. There was even a speaker at the Texas Democrat convention of all places last week. The speaker was a drag queen. And I don't care what you do in your free time as an adult. If you want to be a drag
sure.
queen, go ahead and do that. But don't force your views on other people's young children. The drag queen at the Texas Democrat convention that they platformed as a feature speaker was bragging about how they had performed drag queen story hours for kids and had worked with young children for about a decade, and was also promoting hormone blockers for children and promoting the idea of trans children. That is a huge problem. It should be setting alarm bells off in the heads of Democrats. And if the politicians who are in office right now keep promoting this ideology, they've gotten so far. You would think that rational Democrats would say this is a bridge too far. And this is one of those issues where I think that Republicans can win votes on the issue and Democrats might lose seats on the issue, because you're bringing together a coalition of parents who care about their kids regardless of ideology, regardless of partisanship, because it's only a very small segment of the population that believes this nonsense. And this is what was so genius
But they
about
have a
DeSantis.
lot of power, though. It's a
They
small
do
segment, a lot of power.
they do have a lot of power, but guess what? Parents care about their kids more than anybody else. And so I would hope to believe that we've reached that breaking point. If we haven't, we're pretty dang close, because it looks like the other side, who wants to keep pushing this garbage, sees it as a form of religious indoctrination on their end. They worship the state, and they think that it takes a village. They think that As Joe Biden tweeted recently, there's no such thing as other people's kids, it's society's kids. They think that they have a right to direct the upbringing of other people's children. Hillary Clinton said this with It Takes a Village. And it's gotten louder. Social media has helped expose a lot of this. Libs of TikTok, you got to give Kaya credit for that. Social media, for all of its ills, has helped expose the rot in the system. And so if we keep putting more sunlight on the problem, it's the best disinfectant. It's the best shot that we got. But parents cannot ignore these problems just because they don't think it's happening to their kids today. You should care about other people's children too, and try to have families wake up to these issues, band together, push back, because this is one of the most important issues of our time.
Yeah. And it's just so hard too for parents, because in true technocracy fashion, they're saying, trust the experts, trust the doctors. They know more. How dare you push back against a doctor who knows what's right for these kids with their genders. The book is The Parent Revolution. Corey DeAngelis, phenomenal discussion. I've enjoyed this immensely. I hope we make some progress here. There's the book. I hope we make some progress here, because literally the future of this society depends on these kids. An old saying and an old song is that children are our future, and they are. We better protect them. Corey, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Good to have you. All right, that's going to do it for Strictly Speaking today here on True Blue. Make sure you share this episode with anybody and everybody that you think will benefit from it. And we will see you next time right here on Strictly Speaking.